Okay, so welcome to Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. This episode is slightly different in that it's being brought to you in conjunction with podcasthon.org. Now, Podcasthon is in its third iteration in 2025, and it's a movement that's all about convincing as many podcast hosts as possible to dedicate one episode of their show to a charity of their choice, and then to release those episodes simultaneously in a coordinated effort. This time it's mid-March 2025. So the idea is to create a huge sort of international wave of inspiring audio content that is also about raising awareness for a large number of charities worldwide. It's not, it should be said, a kind of donation drive. It is really about raising awareness. And should you wish to donate to our chosen charity, there'll be a link in the show notes for you to do that. I've asked Ray, because I think we've already established Ray's a much nicer guy than me, much more likely to do charitable work. So I asked Ray to pick our charity for today. So do you want to say a bit about the chosen charity, Ray?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, there are many great charities either of us could have named, but I've chosen a UK-based charity called Winston's Wish. It's a childhood bereavement charity that was founded by a clinical psychologist, actually, who worked in palliative care and end-of-life care, and who noticed that very often one of the most difficult consequences of the death of any person really was the impact on children, and particularly children who didn't, for whatever reason, receive the kind of family or broader support in their grief that they should have. And so set up a sort of an innovative charity about 25 years ago now that still rolls forward, and that is Winston's Wish.
Okay, thank you, Ray. So we're going to come back to Winston's Wish, and we're going to come back to the broader topic of grief in a moment. And as is customary, though, I want to start out by just catching up with you and finding out what you've been up to and what have you noticed in the time since we last spoke.
Well, what I've noticed in the last couple of hours is my legs are really aching for an unusual reason, which I could either just sort of hang there as some mystery, or I could explain. Which would you prefer?
Well, I do like the teasing option, and I feel like I can't contain my curiosity for another hour or so. So spill the tea. What's going on?
This afternoon, I was lucky enough to attend an online training event where I was learning about the application of the kind of psychology that you and I are both involved in, this acceptance and commitment therapy, but particularly as applied to sport. And two brilliant sports psychologists called Dr. Alison Maitland and Jenna Ashford were presenting this workshop. Couple of hours online, great. They wanted to sort of demonstrate to us one of the ways that they show athletes how they can get more used to the idea that feeling uncomfortable with something is sometimes something we have to be able to make room for in order to do something that matters to us. And they wanted to demonstrate it to us. So they had us doing wall squats. I don't know if you know what a wall squat is. It's where you have your back to a wall. Then you kind of like sit down so your knees are at right angles and you just try and hold it there for an uncomfortably long period of time. Whilst in this case, doing the psychological piece of work of either resenting and hating and kind of like wishing the feelings went away, and then alternately being willing to have them, saying, yep, I know you're here, pain and trembling in my case, and I'm willing to have you if that's what it takes. So, you know, it's a principle of psychology we're both very familiar with. I've never really experienced it in that way. As a psychological experience, very valuable. But given it's probably about 40 years since I used to do that exercise regularly, it also really hurts my legs now.
Well, you are an old psychologist, so it's fitting. You didn't film this, did you, by any chance?
Tragically not. Actually, the workshop was filmed, and I think I was on camera at the time, but that's highly secure. That's in our select patrons only channel.
I noticed that you looked at me when you said, I don't know if you know what a wall squat is, Rich. You had a look on your face that said, you don't know what a wall squat is, Rich. That's at least what I interpreted from the look on your face just then.
And?
You'd be right. I had no idea what a wall squat was. So literally like sitting in a kind of seated position, it's not an oxymoron, standing in a seated position against the wall.
Yeah, so the idea is like your hips are at 90 degrees, so your back is flat against the wall. Hips come out 90 degrees, knees 90 degrees. There's variations on it, but for certain sports, skiers do this a lot, but I'm not a skier. In my youth, I played a lot of volleyball, and we used to do that exercise a lot.
Sounds really painful.
After a while, it really is.
Okay, well, wall squats. So there's a new thing. Every day's a school day. There we go. I've learnt a new thing. I won't be trying it later.
Tragically, today's school day is PE.
Yeah, I've got a headache, so
And what about you? What have you been noticing?
well, in a kind of antidote to what seems to be the sort of parlour state of the world, reference to our previous episode, I've been trying to, I guess therapists might call it attention training or positive data logging, like trying to deliberately skew my attention in a more, I don't want to say happier direction, but trying to look for more signs of positivity as an antidote to the overall gloom that I seem to be generally feeling at the state of the world at the moment. So one of the things I noted or tried to pay more attention to was random acts of kindness. So I would like to mention on the podcast, sort of deliberately, two random acts of kindness. So one of them you were party to. Some friends of ours, and I know that they are also listeners of the show, Lydia and Tom. They made us. I'm not entirely sure what it was, right? But it could either be a medallion or perhaps a Christmas tree ornament, but like it was kind of a brass plaque of our podcast logo. As a consequence of them not putting the right stamp on, I didn't get it was meant to be a Christmas present, right? But I didn't get it till relatively recently. Mine arrived in the post. I'd kind of forgotten that I'd already seen your one when we met previously. And so that was just a lovely surprise. I thought, what a nice, kind thing that someone could. I mean, it's like a thing of beauty, this thing. Maybe I'm going to find a way of
Yeah.
making it the logo for today's episode. I'm going to do that so people can
Well,
see it.
that would be fantastic. Yeah, for people who can't visualize it, it's kind of like a stencil, like made of a kind of copper or a brass. Because when I brought it home, the reaction at my house was fantastic. You could use that on the top of a cappuccino to like dust it with cocoa powder, and then people would be drinking your and my faces.
I was thinking you could use it as a graffiti tag as well. But yeah, so that was just a really nice, kind thing to do, right? And that was a lovely thing.
Mm.
So that was one. Then the other one, I'm going to shout out to our friend Mark Oliver, who, like, I don't really know Mark. I would say he's kind of like a professional friend. That makes it sound like I pay him to be a friend, and that's not the case. What I mean is he's someone that he's in the same field of work as us. I would meet him at conferences and things, and so I've got to know him over the years. We live in different parts of the country, wouldn't really hang out in between times. And he listened to a few bits of training that I've done. I think he listened to a few of these podcasts, and the last time I met him, he just brought me a book. Brought me a book out of nowhere. This guy he's an acquaintance. What a kind thing to do. It was a book all about consciousness, and he knew that I would enjoy that. And I thought, what a lovely thing to do. And so in this world where it feels like there's a lot of reason to be sad and downbeat about the state of things, there are these little islands of kindness. And I've wanted to try and deliberately notice those things. And I thought it would be nice to just mention those here tonight.
Do you think there's a reason, going back to our kind of mission statement for the podcast, at looking at what some psychological ideas behind common experiences are? Why do you think we're so much more likely to notice the bad stuff going on than the good stuff?
I mean, I don't know. And I think that some people perhaps think when you're a psychologist, you just sort of know the answer to everything. And spoiler, that isn't the case. When people ask me stuff like that, though, I think where my mind tends to go to is just sort of evolution, in the sense that we are somewhat predisposed to look out for threat. And there's a good reason for that, because if you were back in the hunter-gatherer days, if you saw, I don't know, a yellow patch in the midst of a bush and you thought, oh, look, there's a load of flowers, and you ran towards it, those people probably didn't live as long as the people who thought, oh, that might be a tiger, I'm going to run the other way.
Right.
And so I think a sort of a predisposition to look out for threat, and generally speaking, stop me if I'm getting too technical, bad stuff is probably built into us. Like, we are the descendants of the more cautious, anxious, avoidant people who paid more attention to threat in their environment. I guess that's the way I would think about it.
Right. So kind of failing to spot a threat has much worse consequences than failing to spot a nice thing. Okay. That would make sense.
There's another slightly more detailed answer, which isn't mine. This is inspired by, so this is a book called Determined by a guy called Robert Sapolsky, who's one of my heroes. He talked about the idea that with evolution by natural selection, there's no sort of plan or design as such. And if you were natural selection and you were planning how to make an organism pursue survival goals, such as, eating food and reproducing, like how would you design their brains? And he came up with these sort of three things. So, firstly, you'd have to make the organism experience pleasurable sensations upon completion of the task. So, you drink a coffee, you feel good. You eat a delicious meal, you feel good. Secondly, you'd have to make that pleasurable sensation quite short lived in order that rather than sort of basking in the joy of that forever, oh, there's a wonderful meal, I'm never going to eat again. You would have to make the sensation short lived so that the organism would go and seek that experience again and again and again. And thirdly, the organism's brain should focus on the fact that pleasure will accompany the reaching of a goal rather than on the fact that the pleasure will dissipate shortly thereafter. Does that make sense? So
Right.
you wouldn't want an organism that goes, no, I'm not going to eat because the pleasure is really short lived. You want an organism that's going to go, oh, I'm going to eat because it tastes amazing and I feel really great. Focusing on the pleasure is more likely to encourage the organism to pursue the goal, whereas focusing on the fact that it dissipates would probably encourage the organism just to question, why am I putting so much effort into something that's so short-lived? So
Yeah.
the idea that you can take from that is that we're, human beings, like any other organism, we're creatures that are sort of prone to striving for goals, but we're also creatures for whom pleasure is quite fleeting, and so we're kind of prone to dissatisfaction, almost so we then pursue the pleasurable things like food and sex that are kind of required for our survival and reproduction and the proliferation of our genes. That
Oh,
was
that's
probably more of
really
an answer than you were expecting.
yes, and that's a really interesting answer, particularly about the focus upon the acquiring of it and the sort of, it's not exactly what was being said, but almost as if like programmed forgetting of the fact of how short-lived some of it was going to be. Because yes, certainly I can think of lots of examples of things that you kind of really crave. And actually, yeah, quite soon that the pleasure of it dissipates, of that particular food that you were really looking forward to, or that sort of like slightly splurgy meal. And you already know in advance, well, actually, you're only going to really have enjoyed it briefly, and you might feel a bit bloated or, not happy with yourself or whatever afterwards. And you kind of know that, but you don't think about that while you're anticipating and enjoying the meal. That's a really interesting perspective.
The research kind of bears out the notion that natural selection, and I'm talking about natural selection as if it's got a motive. It hasn't really, but I'm sort of, retro engineering this idea. But that natural selection doesn't want us to be happy, like it wants us to be productive. And the way to make us productive is to be kind of dissatisfied and to make the anticipation of pleasure like it's a strong drive, but the pleasure
Mm.
itself has got to be quite brief. And you can see this in scientific studies in the sense of dopamine receptors light up earlier and earlier along the path in anticipation of reward rather than at the point of the reward. So, I mean, an obvious example of this is training a dog. If I go to the fridge and I start crackling the container of little cocktail sausages, the dog will get super excited. He's not had the sausage, right? He's excited at the anticipation of the sausage. So it's that notion of the reward getting earlier and earlier. But I think we sort of to go back to your question, we spend a lot of time being dissatisfied so that we pursue those rewards, the things that are key to our survival.
Say that weren't true. Or rather, say the argument is true, but we could somehow turn that off and that humans were no longer like that. I wonder what difference we'd see in human behaviour. Because, of course, an argument exists that a lot of the setting conditions for evolution by natural selection at the sort of live, die, reproduce, don't reproduce level, some of that selection pressure is, if not off, is somewhat different in modern humans because of the way we've societally re-engineered our environmental niche. That actual sort of micro-engineering of seek more fat, seek more sugar, seek more mating opportunities, arguably isn't as essential for survival as it once was. And sometimes is actually counter to our survival. There's a very, very good book on adopting healthier lifestyles called Healthy Habits Suck by Dana Lee Bagley. And in that, she makes the argument, I think she's drawn it from other people, that most of the things which we now recognize probably are healthier for us, cutting down fat intake, cutting down sugar intake, exercising more, things that are for most people in the modern world probably pro-health, would actually be, in survival terms, catastrophic for our ancestors. To turn down sources of nutrition, of vitamins and minerals, of laying down fat against the winter or against famine, and particularly the concept of burning off energy, not in the pursuit of running away from a tiger or running towards food. We can't all suicidal to waste energy by just running for the sake of running. So, we have this long history of those things being a terrible idea. And now, because of this very unusual niche we've constructed for ourselves, suddenly they're the things that can keep you healthy and let you live longer. And yet somehow we're surprised that we can't just click our fingers and adopt these healthy habits because they make sense now.
That's really interesting. What a cool perspective. I guess the thing it makes me think of as well is that we sort of live in an age where those things are abundant. Go back 10,000 years or so, you had to work really hard to find those things, and now they're everywhere. I'm getting the image, Wall-E, the film. There's the
Oh,
idea
Pixar
that
film.
all the humans have left the polluted Earth and they're off in this big spaceship somewhere, all enormous and almost unable to walk
Yeah,
because they've just got everything they need right there.
yeah,
Like the 20th century marked a shift, didn't it? It was the first time more people died from having too much than too little.
yeah.
And kind of brings us to our topic for today, which is mortality, grief, and working around the end of life.
Mm,
Obviously, this has a really clear link to Winston's wish. Because this is your area of expertise, I'm gonna defer to you largely with regard to this episode. Before we dive into this topic of grief and mortality, anything you feel like we need to say?
yeah, absolutely. Lot of controversy these days, but the idea of things like trigger warnings, and whether saying, look, we're about to discuss themes of, what we see at the beginning of TV programs and films, whether that actually helps people deal with stuff and has any impact on their ability to manage their internal state around it. I think when we talk about something like this, it's not so much about trigger warning, it's about content
Mm,
warnings, and it's kind of about informed consent, really. We're talking about what is famously one of the things that unites us all, our mortality. And often the hardest bit isn't our own mortality, it's the mortality of others that we love, which we'll come back to. I absolutely don't know who's listening to this, and I don't know what they've been through recently. And it might be that either way back or more recently, they have lost somebody that they love, or they are anticipating losing somebody that they love, or they have a significant challenge to their own health. And that might mean either this isn't really a thing they want to listen to right now, in which case, yeah, other episodes are available. Or it might be exactly the episode they want to listen to, knowing that in talking about this stuff and thinking about this stuff, strong feeling may show up. And maybe strong feeling showing up, tears showing up, isn't actually a disaster when we're turning towards something that is important enough to create those feelings.
I suppose one of the first things then to ask about this is why do you think it is that we find it so hard to talk about? And I would want to emphasize cultural differences right away. I mean,
Mm,
we live very close to Ireland, where I think they just do death a lot better. It's much more of a kind of open thing. It feels like there's more of a celebration
mm,
around the passing of someone. It's more of a community event. It
yeah,
feels like there's less freedom, less willingness to talk openly about death, mortality, grief, all of those things in a UK setting. But given that's where we are, why do you think we find it so hard?
well, I think what you've just acknowledged is one of those things in this setting. It's argued in English type settings and contemporary USA kind of settings. One of the things we've seen in the last century, maybe a bit longer than that, is the removal or the separation of death from everyday life. That the end of life more often takes place in something like a hospital or in a care home, rather than in earlier times where perhaps, again, we're talking about sort of white Western European kind of culture, people less living in extended families, where there are older members of the family who are, valued members of the family and get ill and are looked after and die probably in the house. So people talk about sometimes the sanitization of death or the medicalization of death is certainly one of the changes that has happened. And one of the consequences of that, one of the serious consequences of that, is that it becomes a more mysterious process and therefore a thing that people more fear from a distance. People have less idea of what dying looks like. So an excellent book by a palliative care doctor called Dr. Catherine Mannix is called With the End in Mind. And it's simply an exploration of what death, well handled and well looked after and well supported, will tend to look like. And she wrote that in order to sort of demystify something that probably a while back wouldn't have been a mystery. But because we see less of it and the care is being handed over to specialists more often, it's helpful for people to have the idea of what that process can look like.
Do you know, I'd never really thought about that. That is interesting to me. The idea that the sort of sociological context around death has changed due to the sort of medicalisation of it. And
Yeah.
again, I'm just going to contrast with something I know about, which is Ireland, and like the idea of sort of having the deceased person in the house, I think feels odd to a lot of English people. I don't know, almost like you'd be scared of it somehow, or there's something bad is going to happen, like there's some kind of disease or something. Do you know what I mean? That like
Yeah.
feels like it's one of those things. It's sort of become taboo in a way that other cultures don't struggle with, and perhaps that is
Yeah.
because it's hidden from us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, sort of going back to maybe Victorian times and before, very often that equivalent thing of the body being laid out in the home and people visiting at the home and maybe a wake being in the home was more common. Because the other thing that goes with it is the advancement of medicine. So the fact that people, by and large, live a lot longer these days, that lots of conditions that couldn't be cured before can now be cured, has seemed kind of like a shift. So most, the argument is that go back a couple of 100 years, virtually all medicine was palliative care. I should explain what I mean by palliative care. It's the term we use now for care and within that palliative medicine, where the person has a condition from which they will die, and the treatment is not being aimed at the disease. It is not, the treatment is no longer aimed at attempting to rid the person of the disease or hold it off indefinitely because that can't be done anymore. Rather, the treatment is aimed around comfort, symptom management, retention of choice, dignity, and those kind of things. And the argument goes that actually, if you go back a couple of 100 years, actually most diseases were like that. The chances of a medical treatment making the difference between whether the person lived or died, other than in sort of like acute injuries and infections and things like that, was very low. One of the shifts we've seen is with conditions like, I guess one of the ones I've worked most with is cancer. Cancer being much more treatable, which is fantastic news. It is brilliant news. One of the things that maybe has crept alongside that is the idea that death is a failure of medicine, which is a new idea. The idea that medicine should be able to cure, should be able to allow people to live. And therefore, if we get to the point where it hasn't happened, then somebody has failed. That's not really a realistic view of how human bodies are, given the absolute inevitability of mortality. But there is, therefore, that kind of cultural vibe that death is also to be fought to the very last threshold and then sort of pushed aside. And that's new.
There's something in there for me that I find interesting about, like, I think if you ask the average person, do you think we should create a situation whereby humans are immortal? Most people would go, "Ooh, that there's something sort of
Mm.
weird and horrific about that." But if you ask people, do you think we should continue to try and work to find a cure for cancer? People will go, "Yep." Do you think we should try and find a cure for heart disease? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Do you know what I mean? Like incrementally, it feels like exactly what you're saying. We should like it's almost like a moral imperative. We ought to try and cure these things, but
Yeah,
nobody would go for immortality. Or few, well, some people would, but I think most people would find the idea a bit sort of
yeah.
distasteful.
If you're kind of engineering things, you can imagine things like that. I guess one could have a compromise that said some of the absolute definite kind of like suffering that comes with those diseases, you know, even if we accept a level of mortality that you have your either, your three score year or 10 or call it 85, call it 100, maybe one day it's 120, who knows? If we could get through that time and have as much of that time as possible relatively healthy until we kind of have a quite rapid but well managed decline and death, compared to what can sometimes happen with these illnesses that causes more prolonged suffering and more prolonged difficulty. I think there's a lot to be said for being on top of as many diseases as possible, even if that doesn't mean immortality.
What do you think it is that people are resisting when they resist the idea of death? I wonder what. I mean, you must have a lot of experience of people talking to you about their fears, just from a personal point of view. And I think I've probably mentioned before, I don't have a religious faith. And I think some people look at that, they look at atheism, for example, and they see, like, I want no part of that kind of black hole of despair. But I don't see that. I kind of think, well, because I don't believe in an afterlife, I wasn't alive for, I don't know, 13 billion years. Didn't bother me. I feel like it probably won't bother me after I've gone because I won't be there to be bothered. I'm more worried about old age, if I'm honest, than
Mm.
death. But what do you think people are scared of? What are they resisting about death?
I mean, inevitably, it's a range of things. And one big caveat here is the difference between you and I sitting here with, our health being however it is, but, can't speak for you, Rich, at this moment. And I am actually touching wood as we speak. I am not aware that I have any life limiting condition in me at this moment. I can think about the idea of dying and I'm sort of looking at it from over here as this kind of not entirely abstract, but like hopefully somewhat distant event. I think it is sometimes different when people know what it is they are likely to die of and some broad idea of it being sooner rather than later. I think that does change perception somewhat. But the things that people talk about most, for some people, it is what comes next. So, as you were saying, for some people, the idea that there might be nothing next is troubling, unlike for you. Or they may have a significant faith and have concerns that what happens after their death might not be what they want. So, going to hell or whatever. And I have met people who that has been their source of terror, actually, later in their life. I think that's actually, in the kind of settings I've worked, less common. For some people, the fear is, what is it going to be like to die? What's actually those moments or those hours going to be like? I think for more people, it's what's the run up to it, like, sort of the deterioration of losing function, of experiencing whatever symptoms you're experiencing that they fear, and the knowledge that that's kind of a one-way trip. People can be significantly ill and have hope for you're going to come out the other side of it, but knowing you're not can change that a little bit. But I've got to say, the commonest one that I've heard, and looking at the research and talking to other people, I think this is probably representative, certainly in the places I've worked. People's biggest fear about dying is what the impact is going to be on the people they love. Both the impact as they get iller, the impact of their dying, and the impact of the grief that comes afterwards. That's the biggest source of pain and guilt. Guilt, alongside fear and sadness, actually guilt, one of the strongest emotional experiences that people facing their own death certainly end up talking to people like me about.
Guilty in the sense of like they're leaving and they're leaving other people.
I'm leaving the other person to suffer. This is going to be harder for them than it is for me. Occasionally there is that kind of like, I shouldn't have, I should have looked after my health more. I shouldn't have smoked or whatever. Yes, sometimes there's that concrete one, but there's more often a more general one of, I know this person who I love is going to suffer after I've gone. And I am in some sense the cause of that, even though I haven't chosen this. And that can be a really hard thing for people to deal with.
Yeah, I feel like I want to backtrack on what I said earlier now, because you're sort of unpacking a number of different issues connected to death rather than death itself. I think I don't fear death itself
Mm.
for me, because I just don't think, well, I'll be dead. I won't know anything about it. So the idea of not being here doesn't bother me. The idea of the journey to get there, particularly if it's sort of a painful and, you know, debilitated one, that
Yeah.
bothers me. I do think about the impact upon other people who might be affected by my dying.
In a sense, the biggest, the most kind of intense version of that I have tended to come across has been where the person you're worried about is a child. So, the loss of a grandparent can be devastating for for a child. I guess things that are though slightly more acute when it's the death of a parent when their child is still fairly young. That's one of the things that can weigh most heavily on that person or the surviving parent, which is kind of one of the reasons why when we were kicking around what would be a good charity spotlight for this event, that despite working for a few different like charitable organizations or being associated with them, the one that struck me most for this conversation was Winston's Wish.
And so their main aim is to support grieving children, is that right?
Absolutely. Grieving children, but also it can be children who are facing grief. So for children who are facing the loss of a parent, a lot of their work is in grief beyond it. It started more or less locally in Gloucestershire, but it's now a national organisation. One big thread of it is that it is really, really hard for people to see a child suffer and to see a child breaking their heart. Many years ago, an excellent Channel 4 documentary was made about Winston's Wish, and one of they have like a weekend sort of camp for bereaved kids where they have the opportunity to talk about the person they lost and do lots of activities and ask the doctor section. And then it's like sort of a ritual thing. Brilliant event. With everybody's permission, done very, very sensitively. Film crew followed that. But interestingly, the producer talking to the team who ran Winston's Wish said they probably wouldn't be able to use some of the footage because inevitably there were children who were just breaking their heart. And they said, that's actually probably too much to put on. It would probably be counterproductive. This wasn't a sensationalist program. Yeah, so one of the difficulties is it's really hard to do that. And our urge, of course, is to protect children. And this is where, out of that urge to protect, sometimes inadvertently, we as adults cause more difficulties. While it is absolutely right to be careful and thoughtful about how much information is shared as we, for instance, go through the final illness of a person, the idea of withholding all information when there's clearly something going on can easily be made out of a desire to protect the child. Sometimes it's also driven by how difficult and uncomfortable a conversation that would be to have. The person's avoiding their own discomfort as much as protecting the child without realizing it. And in grief, in order to protect the child, sort of not talking about the loss, not talking about the person, not encouraging things that really bring that person and the pain that comes with that back. Charities like Winston's Wish and other charities are doing equally superb work in this, are about redressing that balance a little, supporting the parents with good advice about how can you talk to your kids, but also providing the stuff directly to the kids. And one of the things, I guess, since I was more involved many years ago now in this online world is they have properly moderated and safe online groups for young people where they can talk about what it's like. And this is the other half of the overprotection equation. Kids protect adults. They don't say stuff that they know is going to really upset their grieving mom or grieving dad. So they kind of tend to hold it in. The only people they might possibly talk to are people their own age, but most of their friends their own age haven't experienced what they're experiencing. So the chance to have contact in a safe setting with other young people who've been through similar things is absolutely golden. And access to trained professionals who can give additional help where needed can make a huge difference to people.
One of the things that would probably be a fairly central tenet in acceptance and commitment therapy is the idea of when we engage in avoidance, we are usually doing so because we are trying to get away from uncomfortable internal sensations. So, uncomfortable thoughts, uncomfortable emotions, physical pain. We engage in avoidant behavior as a means of keeping that stuff at arm's length.
Mm.
And whilst that can work really well in the short term, it can have some obvious benefits. It tends not to work well over the long haul. So if you kind of make it your mission to never feel uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, that can take quite a toll on you over a long time because you're constructing your life in such a way as just to avoid the bad stuff. So that usually thereby making your life quite small. And of course, if you make your life quite small to avoid the bad stuff, you tend to shut out a lot of the good stuff too. Where do you stand on that in relation to grief? Does that sort of basic tenet hold up, that like avoidance can be useful in the short term, but if you just avoid the subject, if you avoid the pain of it over the long run, it's probably not going to be that helpful?
Yeah, I think some of those sort of classic mechanisms we've talked there are very relevant in grief. Not two griefs are alike, not two losses are alike. It's worth spelling out here, not what we mean by some of these words, but how I am using some of these words. So, the loss is the death of a person or the end of a career or the loss of a country if you have to flee. So that's the loss is the event, as it were, and the removal from your environment of something that was important to you. Grief is the kind of sum total of our response to that emotional in our thoughts and in our behaviors. So inevitably, all griefs differ. One of the things about grief, though, is it is probably the most common source of high level distress in humans. Most people, if they're lucky, aren't going to go through a period where they have sort of like repeated episodes of panic disorder or crushing depression or go through periods where they're hearing highly disturbing voices. Most of us aren't going to have those things so much. Anybody who's old enough and is lucky enough to have love in their life will experience loss. And because of that loss, is highly likely to experience grief. So there's a famous saying that the risk of love is loss, and the price of loss is grief. So absolutely that attempted avoidance of unwanted emotional experience that we were just talking about, ending up sort of shaping your behavior and narrowing your life, can go on. One of the things with grief, though, is it tends to like just break down the walls a lot. It tends to punch through quite a bit. Quite often, particularly in the earlier months and years, there's no real way of avoiding. The question is more often what you do when it shows up. And there can be that sort of escape avoidance. There could be attempts at distraction. There could be trying to dull the pain with alcohol or other behaviors. And there can be an attempt to suppress. So one of the things I often hear from people in grief is a desperate hanging on to not allow emotion to happen as much, not to let it flow. And the most common sort of metaphor that naturally occurs to people is the dam will break. I'm kind of holding on, and maybe the person's got responsibilities, they've got kids or whatever, they've got to hold it together. I've got to hold it together. But if I allow myself to cry and grieve, the dam will break and disaster will follow, which is an interesting metaphor. The issue with the dam breaking is the problem kind of is created by the creation of a dam. Rather than being like a dam or a set of walls that try and hold back emotion at all costs, which one day will get overwhelmed catastrophically, a way I prefer to think about it and talk about it with people is being more like a floodplain. People are probably familiar with the idea that a small stream or a small river, and the level of the river will rise and fall over the year, but a couple of times a year, you get more water through. And then you get this distinctive pattern of all the fields around flooding, not very deeply necessarily, but they will flood. And then over a few weeks, that will drain down and things will continue. And the point is, if you know that's going to happen, you don't attempt to stop the process. It works. Things return. Actually, what happens is loads of nutrients get washed down and the fields get very fertile. And it all works until somebody tries to dam that, build walls in order to build a new housing estate or something. That's when the natural rise and fall of emotions sometimes can end up with really unwanted consequences. So my argument would be try to be more of a floodplain and less of a dam.
Yeah, don't build the dam and the dam won't break.
Yeah. A dam as a permanent structure, it's really important to be kind of realistic about this, that even in the early stages of grief, and this is one of the faults with some of the traditional models of grief, that you go through this stage, you go through sort of shock, and then you go through anger and bargaining and this. One of the problems with that is the suggestion that there is a predictable, pretty unidirectional path through it. And actually, that doesn't seem to be how people are. What you see is people swinging backwards and forwards, even within a single day, between sort of a loss orientation, where we are thinking about the person, perhaps looking through photographs, being tearful, and then sort of a rebuilding or restoration orientation, where people are having to learn new skills, find a new way of living. And part of that may occasionally be very, very temporary, kind of holding back the tears, keeping it together for that half hour while you have to go and get the death certificate signed. But my advice always would then be, it's okay to try and hold it back. It's okay to do what you need to do to get through that bit. Just make sure there's room later on for whatever to come out that needs to come out.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I guess I am going to like it because it feels very familiar to me with regard to the way that the act talks about emotions more generally. That like they're never wrong, are they? Emotions, they're just doing what they're doing. What's that famous actism that the problem isn't the problem, the solution is the problem. So there's
Yeah,
nothing wrong with being anxious, for example, but what tends to be problematic is trying really hard not to be anxious and constructing your life in such a way as to avoid all anxiety. It tends to sort of keep anxiety or the fear of it like front and center. So I guess the
yeah,
same can be said of grief. If you try really hard not to grieve, you're keeping it really front and center rather than just letting it ebb and flow as it will. That
yeah,
feels like a more functional way of going about it.
yeah. And I think some of that urge to do it the other way actually comes from a way of regarding both intense suffering and a sort of full and meaningful life. And in one way, you could say that sometimes people see those two as being in opposition. You know, whilst one has intense suffering of grief, by that very definition, you can't have a fulfilling and meaningful life. Those are kind of like opposites of each other. And for people who are struggling with that, sometimes some of the kind of the therapeutic work in grief, one way of describing it is with changing that to be, instead of those two things being the opposite of each other, change it to being more like the pain and loss of grief are part of a meaningful and fulfilling life. That we move forward in our meaningful and fulfilling life with the pain of sadness and loss, because that's an inevitable part of having love in our life. In technical terms, it always says like there's like a hierarchical relation between that pain and a full and meaningful life, rather than an opposition between the two of them.
I'm interested in asking you about your own sort of role in it. Because I guess of all the things you could do as a psychologist, you've not picked an easy area. You've picked something that is somewhat taboo. And you've picked an area where you're going to be spending your time with deep sadness and pain. It feels like an obvious question to ask you, almost a cliche, but I wonder, how has that impacted upon you, do you think? And your own thoughts about your own mortality?
I mean, that's a really good question, and one that I think in this kind of field you do end up reflecting on at times. It's a weird word to use in this context, but there's what we sometimes call a survivorship bias here. I ended up working for the best part, well, I still am working part of my time in it. So I have been working for sort of 34 years in this kind of stuff. The very fact that I've continued to work means that, there's something about it that matches me and that I'm okay with and I can make room for. It might be different for other people who are looking at it for time and then go on to something else. And of course, this is one flavour of suffering. There are plenties of flavours of suffering out there in the world. And some of them I know I couldn't work with. So some of this is a horses for courses kind of a deal. I know in the past that you've worked in forensics, in units with people part of the criminal justice system, some of them who've sort of done sort of really bad things in the world. And I think I would find that harder to work with than some of the people that I've worked with. So there is that little bit of individual difference. I think one of the ways it affects me is you can't pretend it's not there. One of the things is because most of the time, most of us aren't thinking about death. And that makes sense. Like if you walked around with it right in front of your face, every hour, every day, you wouldn't get on with much. That wouldn't be very successful. Lots of time, people just sort of push the whole thing away. Something only happens to other people, it only happens in fiction on TV. And I guess working in this area, you can't pretend that's true because you're very close in with families, not just as cases or diagnoses, but, talking to them about what life was like before and their hopes and their fears and all this kind of stuff. So these have become really whole, sort of real people to you very rapidly. So you're kind of very aware of that. And I guess it does have a variety of effects. And sometimes, yeah, it can have an effect of, there have been times in my career where I've been astonished I've made it to the end of a year because your sample base becomes so skewed. You only get to see the people for whom something like this is going on. And when people tell you their story, I remember it struck me once, like if you're first interview with somebody and they say, well, one day I woke up and I had a really bad cough. The story's not going to end up with, it turns out it was just a cough. So every time you hear one of those early symptoms, it's always going to end up with something catastrophic, or else they wouldn't be telling you. So you're kind of, when you get a bit of a cough or you get a bit of a bad back, you've got this massive database of how horribly wrong that went for some people that you met. And so sometimes, you can become, I guess, a little bit more, oh no, about any of those things. There are the moments of that. But the thing that I guess strikes me most is a positive thing. And that is knowing that we do die and knowing some of what goes on kind of around that. Two sets of things kind of then impact me. One of which is the things that make a difference, so like some practical things. Even though, yeah, again, touching wood, relatively healthy, blah, 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 blah. Since I was first doing this work so I was about like 30, I've always had an up-to-date will. More recently, I've always had an up-to-date power of attorney. Power of attorney is a really important document. It's what says that if you lose capacity through illness or injury, that you cannot take decisions you normally would take independently. You've nominated another person who can do that for you. That can make all the difference at a time like that. It's a legal process. It needs setting up. That's all done, even though there was no particular concrete triggering reason for doing it. People know what music I want at my funeral, all that kind of stuff. So there's that sort of practical side. And sometimes knowing that that's handled takes a weight off anyway. But the other thing is, I'm always worried when I say this, it kind of sounds a bit trite or cheesy. But when people at the end of their life, and time is very short, sometimes they will talk about regrets or things that they're missing. I very, very strongly believe that at that kind of like end of life thing, people don't look back and say, I wish I had one more healthy day in order to go and see the pyramids or to go and climb Everest. What they say is, one more afternoon with my family, one more night down the pub with my friends, one more really good cup of coffee I can really taste. Those are the things that people miss at the end and anticipate never being able to do again. And the good thing about all this is we can still do that. Whatever your version of that is, you can still do that today, tomorrow, this week. So do it today, tomorrow, and this week, because there will come a day when you'd give anything to be back able to do it. So do it.
Wow, that certainly makes you think. I'm sure you're aware of this. It's going to be about the only thing I can bring to the party in this episode. You know Bronnie Ware? She was a nurse working in your field for many, many years and came up with this concept of the top 5 regrets of the dying.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
So here they are. I don't know if these are in order, but number 1, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. Number 2, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Number 3, I wish I'd been brave enough to express my feelings. Number 4, I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. Number 5, I wish that I had let myself be happier. When I first saw that list, that really kind of hit me as being, so here's the experience of someone who's worked like you have with people at the end of their life for many, many years. And these are the sort of top 5 things. Much like you said, it's not about the pyramids. It's those kind of simple things, isn't it? And really struck by, no one's saying, well, I wish I'd worked harder or I wish I'd got that promotion. It's none of that, is it?
Yeah. the difficulty with all of these things is the likes of you and me are always going to sort of then mess it up by saying, well, it depends. And context is everything. So I literally have met people who said, I wish I'd worked harder because they'd had opportunities they didn't take. They could have provided differently for their family. They thought they could have been really good at something if they just had stuck at it a bit more. I think with all these things, as with absolutely everything I have said, we need to kind of remember the individual and we need to remember people will differ. The best thing we can do is by not backing off and not being scared of having the conversation, because people who are in this situation, who know they're facing their own death, will say that they see people literally cross the road to avoid talking to them. Not because they're bad people, not because they think it's going to catch, but because they don't know what to say and they fear making it worse. Where actually that rejection is the thing that tends to make it worse. So if we could talk to people and just be willing to ask them how they're doing today and have whatever level of conversation that person wants back at us, whether they want to tell us the deepest, darkest bits, or they clearly just want to talk crap about what's on TV, just respond to that as whatever the person needs. We don't need to know a whole stack about it beforehand. You just need to try and engage with the human, even at that time in life and in grief, where the same things play out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that same thing is a common experience for people who are bereaved, right? It's that people avoid them because they don't know what to say. You get the kind of trite, I'm sorry for your loss, one-liners
Yeah.
as the kind of substitute for anything meaningful because people really don't know how to address it. It is curious. I mean, the more we talk about this, I think it's really curious, isn't it, how it's so taboo, given that, as you said earlier, it's the only thing that's going to that's the only one of the very few things that's gonna touch everybody. Far more
Absolutely.
so than depression or psychosis.
Mm.
The grief is gonna I
Yeah.
can't think of anybody I know that hasn't been touched by grief.
And oddly, I was teaching on grief in Sicily, of all places, last weekend, which was brilliant. Met some fantastic people. And two of the fantastic people I met were the translators who, because I have no Italian, although most of the audience had, great basic English. We needed to be right about what we were talking about quite technically at times. And the translators were saying, actually, there's no exact translation of grief. To Italian, there is loss, there is mourning, which is more like the behavioral component of grief. But, kind of the closest we could get was the pain of the loss, which isn't bad, but it's odd that there wasn't a single type translation. These were top level professional translators. It was not a shortcoming in them as people. The fact that this thing that we all experience is something that sometimes we literally don't have the words for is odd. And I think it's important that we can notice that and do our best not to make this some separate and untouchable area of human experience, but rather make room for it as part of what comes with being alive, and particularly if we're lucky enough to have people or things that we love in our life.
I wonder, just in terms of trying to summarize what we've been talking about, I'm sure there are bound to be people listening for whom this is a very current issue, or is going to be in the near future. I wonder what you would say to people in terms of takeaways, I suppose. What have you learned in terms of a trying to forge a healthy relationship with grief?
I guess I'd sort of reiterate a couple of things that have popped up during the conversation. It's not simply accepting that loss, whether it's loss of others or loss of ourselves, is important and an inevitable part of life, but more particularly that sadness and other emotions like guilt or anxiety come with that, and that we don't need to squash those down. We don't need to pretend that it's not happening. We can communicate. And we can even communicate it to people. Natural protective instinct makes us try and hide it from, whether it's our partners, whether it's our parents, whether it's our children. It can be quite helpful to say, I'm really sad today because. So trying to keep the communication, because we don't have to fix anything here. There's nothing here to be fixed, but we can keep communicating and keep supporting. What else would I say? Actually, the really pragmatic stuff is really helpful. What I was talking about, wills and powers of attorney and stuff, and letting people know what your wishes might be around a funeral. Actually, you can save your loved ones an awful lot of stress and pain and heartache by getting that sorted out now. Doesn't mean you're giving in. It doesn't mean you're being morbid. It just means you're protecting people you love from even more hassle at a time when they're potentially devastated if you die. And the other bit would be exactly what I was saying before, and takes us back to your start point, actually, the things you've been noticing about, as well as paying attention to the difficult stuff and the threat, is also paying attention to the stuff that we have now that we will lose either with our illness or with the death of somebody we love. And rather than be paralyzed by the prospect of that loss, make sure that we're making the most of it now. Not like in some having to hang on tight and every day has to be perfect, every holiday has to be perfect, but just the simplicity of those moments and small behaviors that really means something to us. Make sure you still take the time for them and enjoy them for what they are while you still can.
Thank you. Yeah, that's real. It's real food for thought, isn't it? I think just sort of going back to what I was saying earlier, just like I think life's amazing. Like I genuinely don't know what happened before I was here, and I don't think I'll know what will happen after. What I do know is I've got this sort of wonderful gift of whatever that might be, 70 or 80
Mm.
years if I'm lucky. And, life is just amazing. There's so much about life that can be appreciated. There is something about the sort of fast pace of life in a Western liberal democracy. Everyone's spinning 100 plates. Nobody has time to do anything. Yeah, just the simple art of slowing down and noticing what you have around you does feel like a really important, yeah, if somewhat Miss Worldish thing to say. It does feel important, doesn't it?
It really does. We can't be like that all the time. It will become another incredible pressure to be mindful and grateful every moment of the day. That sounds like hell to me. But moments of it can really make a difference.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to end that conversation there, but there's still time for me to ask you a question if you're up for it.
Oh, I think I still am.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
So, somewhat in keeping with the theme of reflection and looking forward and looking back, what is one thing that, if you had the opportunity, you would tell your childhood self?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, this might not be the most profound answer you could ever get, but when somebody offers you tickets for one of David Bowie's last tours, don't think, oh no, I'm too busy at the moment, I'll catch it later, because he'll never tour again. So I would definitely have taken the tickets to see him. I mean, if that's the biggest regret or the biggest piece of advice I've got looking back, that's not bad really, is it?
That was a pretty big mistake that you made there, but yeah, not bad in
It
the
was
scheme of
horrendous.
things. In the scheme of things that can go wrong, you're on fairly safe ground there.
Fairly safe. You got anything like that? What would you tell young Master Bennett?
I think I would say don't be so frightened. Well, would I? I think I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't say that. That sounds a bit mean. I think I would say don't give in to your fear quite so much.
Right.
Try and have your fear rather than let it have you. I think anxiety's probably got in the way of me doing things at various points in my life. Not regrets as such. Don't know. Be a bit braver. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's not going to kill you.
So that might have been a nicer lesson to pick up earlier.
Yeah, I think it took a long time to learn that.
Yeah.
And I think there's good reasons why it took a while. And if I could time travel and give myself a bit of advice, I think that's what it would be. So, anxiety it's uncomfortable, and that's the worst thing about it. You don't have to allow it to hold you back.
That's a much more valuable message than my one about Bowie tickets, isn't it?
Although,
Although,
if you're out there and your favourite band's touring, go and see them. Go and see them.
Yeah.
Because they or you won't be around forever. That feels very in keeping with what we were saying earlier. Okay, on that piece of sage advice, I think we'll leave it. So thank you very much, Ray. It's been a very thought-provoking and moving conversation. So thank you very much.
thank you, Rich. And thank you for being willing to have this conversation today.
You're very welcome. I'll see you again soon.
See you soon.